From 1945 until 1991, the world lived under a shadow, not defined by open battlefields, but by a persistent, invisible conflict between ideologies, superpowers, and competing visions of the future. This era, known as the Cold War, was not just a standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was a global struggle that shaped nations, revolutions, borders, and the lives of billions. It was a time when the world was divided by an iron curtain, when the threat of nuclear weapons hung over humanity, and when proxy wars in distant lands represented much larger battles for global influence. To understand the modern world, politics, alliances, conflicts, and even technology, we must first understand how this Cold War began, how it unfolded, and why it finally came to an end. When the guns of World War II fell silent in 1945, the global landscape was forever changed. Two nations emerged from the conflict not merely victorious, but preeminent: the United States and the Soviet Union. Yet their cooperation during the war was rooted in necessity, not trust. The US stood for capitalism and democratic governance, while the USSR championed communism and centralized state power. These differing worldviews, once allied against a common enemy, now became the fault lines of a new global confrontation. What began as diplomatic tension quickly became a strategic rivalry as both superpowers jockeyed for influence in war-ruined Europe. The United States and the Soviet Union Cold War rivalry reshaped borders and ideologies, dividing countries into East and West, and setting up competing political systems that would persist for decades. One of the first public acknowledgments of this growing divide came in 1946, when former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill famously declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. This metaphor symbolized the emergence of two opposing blocs, one led by the United States in the West, and the other by the Soviet Union in the East. As nations rebuilt from World War II's destruction, this ideological division influenced diplomatic decisions, economic aid, and military positioning. The defining moment came when the US announced the Truman Doctrine, pledging support for countries resisting communist influence, and later the Marshall Plan, which provided economic assistance to rebuild Western Europe. These policies did more than rebuild cities. They marked the first formal steps in a dramatic global struggle. As the superpower rivalry intensified, Berlin became a flashpoint that revealed the rising anxiety and mistrust between East and West. After World War II, Germany had been divided into occupation zones, with the Soviet Union controlling the East and the Western Allies controlling the West. When the Western powers moved to unify their zones politically and economically, the Soviet Union responded with the Berlin Blockade, cutting off land access to West Berlin in 1948. The Western Allies replied with the Berlin Airlift, supplying West Berliners by air for nearly a year. This extraordinary operation did more than keep a city alive. It was an early test of resolve in the Cold War timeline, and the first major confrontation that defined the post-war era. The operation demonstrated that the United States and its allies were prepared to challenge Soviet pressure without resorting to direct military combat. As Berlin became a symbol of resistance, the rivalry also took shape through formal alliances. In 1949, the United States and its Western European allies formed NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a collective defense pact that declared an attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. In response, the Soviet Union and its satellite states created the Warsaw Pact in 1955. These military alliances locked in a bipolar world order, where global security was measured not through battlefield victories, but through strategic positioning, deterrence, and balance of power. These alliances would play central roles throughout the Cold War. Nations far beyond Europe felt the influence of these blocs, often shaped more by alignment than by choice. The division of the world into East and West was no longer theoretical, but institutionalized in military pacts and political commitments that raised the stakes for every dispute. While the United States and the Soviet Union avoided direct confrontation, the Cold War quickly became global. Proxy conflicts, Wars fought in other nations but financed or supported by the superpowers became the hallmark of the era. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, for example, began when North Korean forces crossed into South Korea. With the US supporting the South and the Soviet Union backing the North, the conflict raged for years before ending in a stalemate that left the Korean peninsula divided to this day. Far from East Asia, in Southeast Asia, the Vietnam War became another epic chapter in the Cold War's expansion. What began as a struggle against colonial rule evolved into a long and costly confrontation between communist and anti-communist forces, with immense human and political consequences. These wars revealed that Cold War competition was not limited to Europe. Its influence extended into Africa, Asia, and Latin America, transforming regional struggles into components of a larger geopolitical contest. Perhaps the most defining feature of the Cold War was the nuclear arms race, a competition not just for territory or influence, but for the capacity to destroy entire civilizations. The United States and the Soviet Union amassed ever larger arsenals of nuclear weapons, creating a balance of terror known as mutually assured destruction. One moment brought this tension to the world's door: the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. When the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the US mainland, the confrontation lasted 13 days and brought humanity closer to nuclear war than ever before. Only through intense negotiations did both sides agree to withdraw missiles, averting catastrophe. This crisis became synonymous with the height of Cold War tension, illustrating both the peril and restraint that defined the era. The Cold War was not merely about armies and alliances. It was also about ideas, culture, and technological achievement. One of the most visible arenas of competition was the space race. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth, shocking the world and triggering a sense of urgency in the United States. The two powers raced not only to land a man on the moon, but also to demonstrate technological superiority and national prestige. The rivalry extended into everyday life. In the United States, fears of communist influence fueled the Red Scare and investigations into alleged subversion, while propaganda on both sides portrayed the other as a fundamental threat. Civil defense measures, such as duck and cover drills, reminded citizens that the Cold War shadow reached into ordinary existence. By the 1970s, both superpowers recognized the danger of perpetual confrontation and began a period known as détente. Treaties such as the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, sought to limit nuclear arsenals, and diplomatic engagements eased tensions temporarily. However, détente was not permanent. Events such as the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 reignited hostilities, illustrating that Cold War rivalries could shift suddenly with political changes. The 1980s saw escalated rhetoric and military competition once again, particularly under US President Ronald Reagan's leadership, which emphasized a firm stance against the Soviet Union. In the mid-1980s, profound change came from within the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev introduced reforms, perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness, aimed at revitalizing the Soviet system. These changes loosened control over Eastern European satellite states and opened space for political discussion and reform movements. By 1989, the symbolic fortress of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall, fell, marking the end of an era of division and the beginning of democratic transitions in Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union itself dissolved in 1991, formally ending the Cold War. The Cold War's end did not make it irrelevant. Its legacy endures in global politics, military alliances, economic systems, and cultural memory. NATO persists, Russia remains a central global actor, and the lessons of nuclear brinkmanship inform modern diplomacy. Understanding the Cold War history, its origins, events, and consequences, helps us grasp the complexities of modern international relations. It reminds us that conflicts can unfold not just on battlefields, but in ideologies, economic systems, and the shadows of mutual fear and ambition.